George Washington commanded the Continental Army in American Revolutionary War, and was the first President of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797. Because of his central role in the founding of the United States, Washington is often called the father of his country. His devotion to republicanism and civic virtue made him an exemplary figure among early American politicians. Washington's military experience began in the French and Indian War with a commission as a major in the militia of the British province of Virginia. In 1753, Washington was sent as an ambassador from the British Crown to the French officials and Indians as far north as present-day Erie, Pennsylvania. The following year he led another expedition to the area to assist in the construction of a fort at present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Before reaching that point, he and some of his men, accompanied by Indian allies, ambushed a French scouting party. Its leader was killed, although the exact circumstances of his death were disputed. This peacetime act of aggression is seen as one of the first military steps leading to the global 7 Years' War. The French responded by attacking fortifications Washington erected following the ambush, forcing his surrender. Released on parole, Washington and his troops returned to Virginia. In 1755 he participated as a volunteer aide in the ill-fated expedition of General Edward Braddock, where he distinguished himself in the retreat following the climactic Battle of Monongahela. He served from 1755 until 1758 as colonel and commander of the Virginia Regiment, directing the provincial defenses against French and Indian raids and building the regiment into one of the best-trained provincial militias of the time. He led the regiment as part of the 1758 expedition of General John Forbes that successfully drove the French from Fort Duquesne, during which he and some of his companies were involved in a friendly fire incident. Unable to get a commission in the British Army, Washington then resigned from the provincial militia, married, and took up the life of a Virginia plantation owner. Washington gained valuable military skills during the war, acquiring tactical, strategic, and logistical military experience. He also acquired important political skills in his dealings with the British military establishment and the provincial government. His military exploits, although they included some notable failures, made his military reputation in the colonies such that he became a natural selection as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army following the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. His successes in military and political spheres during that conflict led to his election as the first President of the United States of America. Background: born into a well-to-do Virginia family near Fredericksburg in 1732, OS. 1731, Washington was schooled locally until the age of 15. The early death of his father when he was 11 eliminated the possibility of schooling in England, and his mother rejected attempts to place him in the Royal Navy. Thanks to the connection by marriage of his half-brother Lawrence to the wealthy Fairfax family, Washington was appointed surveyor of Culpeper County in 1749. He was just 17 years old. Washington's brother had purchased an interest in the Ohio Company, a land acquisition and settlement company whose objective was the settlement of Virginia's frontier areas, including the Ohio Country, territory north and west of the Ohio River. Emissary: the Ohio Country was occupied by a variety of Indian tribes that were nominally under the suzerainty of the Iroquois Confederacy based in what is now northwestern New York. The area was also the subject of several conflicting claims by British and French colonies. The British provinces of Virginia and Pennsylvania both claimed the area, and traders from Pennsylvania had been trading with the Indians at least since the early 1740s. In 1752, representatives of the Ohio Company reached an agreement with the local Indian leaders allowing the construction of a fort and a small settlement at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, and for the establishment of some settlements south of the Ohio River. The French were alarmed by these developments, and in 1753 began the construction of a series of fortifications in the uppermost headwaters of the Ohio River, intending to extend the line of forts downriver and deny British traders and settlers access to the territory. When news of this reached Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie sought advice from the British government in London. He received orders to send a messenger to the French, reiterating British claims and demanding that they stop construction of their forts and quit the territory. Governor Dinwiddie chose Major Washington, then 21 years old, for the trek into the Ohio country to assess the French military situation, and to deliver the British demands. He was a good choice despite his youth because he was familiar with the frontier from survey work, had good health, and both government and Ohio Company leaders trusted Washington. Although he had no frontier warfare experience, neither did most other Virginians. Washington departed from Williamsburg at the end of October 1753. In Fredericksburg he picked up Jacob Van Braam, a family friend who spoke French, before heading into the Virginia highlands. There he was joined by Christopher Gist, an Ohio Company agent who was familiar with the territory, and a few backwoodsmen to assist with expedition logistics. When the expedition arrived at the site of the proposed fort, Washington noted that the site was well chosen, having the entire command of the Monongahela. The expedition then proceeded on to Logstown, a large Indian settlement a short way down the Ohio River. After parleying with the Indians, the Mingo, Half-King, Tanacharasson and 3 of his men agreed to accompany the British expedition to meet with the French. Washington also learned that many of the Ohio tribes were as unhappy about the British plans for settling the area as they were of the French plans to fortify it. Leaving Logstown on November 30, they arrived at Fort Maco on December 4. The commander there, Captain Philippe Thomas de Joncaire, directed Washington to his superior officer, stationed at Fort Le Boeuf, further north. While dining with Joncaire, Washington learned of French intentions to take possession of the Ohio. Washington's party reached Fort Le Boeuf on December 11, in the middle of a raging snowstorm. The French commander, Captain Jacques Lagarde de Saint-Pierre, received them with hospitality. However, in response to Dinwiddie's demands, he pointed out that the letter was more properly addressed to his superior, New France's governor the Marquis Duquesne. The letter Lagarde drafted in response to Dinwiddie's was clear and to the point. As to the summons you send me to retire, I do not think myself obliged to obey it. Washington took careful notes of the military arrangements at both forts before departing on December 16. He was somewhat concerned by the fact that Tanacharasson and his men remained behind for further discussions with the French. He wrote, "I saw that every stratagem which the most fruitful brain could invent was practiced to win Half-King to their interest." He returned to Williamsburg after a month of difficult travel. Dinwiddie had Washington's account of the expedition widely distributed to emphasize the French threat. It was printed on both sides of the Atlantic, giving Washington an international reputation. Jumonville and Fort Necessity. While Washington was returning from this expedition, Dinwiddie sent men from the Ohio Company under William Trent to begin construction of the company's fort. In February, with Tanacharason's blessing, Trent and his men began construction of the fort at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Lagarde's successor at Venango, Claude-Pierre Pécaudy de Contrecoeur, led a force of about 500 men, Canadians and Indians, to dislodge them. On April 16, they arrived at the Forks. The next day, Trent's force of 36 men, led by Ensign Edward Ward in Trent's absence, agreed to leave the site, over the vociferous objections of Tanacharasson. The French then began construction of Fort Duquesne. Washington, upon his return to Williamsburg, was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the newly created Virginia Regiment, and ordered by Dinwiddie to raise a force to assist in the completion of Trent's fort. Dinwiddie's orders were to act on the defensive, but in case any attempts are made to obstruct the works or interrupt our settlements by any persons whatsoever, you are to restrain all such offenders, and in case of resistance to make prisoners of or kill and destroy them. Historian Fred Anderson describes Dinwiddie's instructions, which were issued without the knowledge or direction of the British government, as an invitation to start a war. Washington was ordered to gather up as many supplies and paid volunteers as he could along the way. By the time he left for the frontier on April 2, he had recruited fewer than 160 men. Moving quickly and without artillery, his force marched north and west, picking up additional militia companies along the way. On April 19, outside Winchester, Virginia, Washington received word that a large French force was descending the Allegheny. On reaching Wills Creek, he met part of Trent's company, who, in addition to confirming the arrival of the French, brought a supportive message from Tanacharison. To keep Tanacharison's support, Washington decided to advance rather than turning back. However, road building went slowly, and by the end of May Washington's company had reached a place known as the Great Meadows, about 37 miles south of the Forks. There he began construction of a small fort and awaited further news or instructions. On May 23, Contrecoeur, now in command at Fort Duquesne, sent Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville with 35 Canadians to see if Washington had entered French territory, and with a summons to order Washington's troops out. This summons was similar in nature to the one Washington had delivered to them in 1753. On May 27, Washington was told by Christopher Gist that a French party numbering about 50 was in the area. In response, Washington sent 75 men with Gist to find them. That evening, Washington received a message from Tanacharison, informing him that he had found the Canadians' camp, and that the two of them should meet. The Mingo leader had with him 12 warriors, 2 of whom were boys. After discussing the matter, the two leaders agreed to make an attack on the Canadians. Washington and Tanacharison then ambushed Jumonville's party, sneaking up and surrounding the French camp. Some were still asleep, others preparing breakfast, when without warning, Washington gave the order to fire. Those who escaped the volley scrambled for their weapons, but were swiftly overwhelmed. 10 of the French, including Jumonville, were killed, 1 was wounded, and all but 1 of the rest were taken prisoner. The exact circumstances of Jumonville's death are disputed. Contrecoeur claimed that Jumonville and most of the other wounded French were massacred in cold blood by British musket fire after having surrendered. Washington claimed in his account that Jumonville was killed, but did not give any details. Other accounts claimed that Tanacharison tomahawked Jumonville while he was reading the summons. When the British left the battlefield to return to their camp at Great Meadows, they did not bury any of the French dead. Washington then finished building Fort Necessity at the Great Meadows, anticipating a French counterattack. The fort, completed June 2, was not much more than a wooden stockade 7 feet high and about 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by a ditch. It was so poorly sited that Tanacharison tried to point out its defects. Washington dismissed these concerns, convinced the fort could withstand the attack of 500 Indians. Over the next month, his force grew by 200 men from Virginia and an independent company of 100 British regulars that had marched up from South Carolina. While he continued to build the road toward the Forks, the arriving Virginians brought congratulations from Governor Dinwiddie on his success at Jumonville Glen, and word that Washington had been promoted to colonel, owing to the death of Colonel Joshua Fry in a fall from his horse. While the road building went on, Washington pressed Tanacharison for more Indian support. However, the Half-King seemed to have lost confidence in the British cause, and he and his followers soon abandoned the British camp. This complete loss of Indian support prompted Washington to withdraw his work crews back to Fort Necessity. Not long afterward, a force of 700 French and Indians surrounded the fort, and Washington was soon compelled to surrender. The surrender document that Washington signed prevented his men from returning to the Ohio country for 1 year, and included an admission that Jumonville had been assassinated. Because the French claimed that Jumonville's party had been on a diplomatic mission, the Jumonville affair became an international incident, and the military escalation that followed blossomed into the global 7 Years' War. Although most Virginians were not particularly critical, there was rumbling about Washington's actions in other quarters. One New Yorker wrote that Washington acted rashly and that he was too ambitious of acquiring all the honor, while London commentators dismissed the failure casually, citing a lack of colonial military experience. Governor Dinwiddie was publicly supportive of Washington, but criticized him privately, noting that some of the Virginia regiment's problems originated in a want of proper command. Dinwiddie assigned command of the follow-up expedition to North Carolina militia Colonel James Innes. In another step that may have been calculated to clip the young colonel's wings, Dinwiddie reorganized the Virginia regiment into separate companies. With no ranks above captain, Washington resigned rather than accepted demotion. Braddock's defeat. In 1755, as part of the British military escalation, Major General Edward Braddock arrived in North America with a force of British Army regulars to head a major effort against the French in the Ohio country. Washington wanted to serve on the expedition, but refused to do so as a provincial officer, since he would be outranked by even junior officers in the regular army establishment. Through negotiations mediated by Governor Dinwiddie, Washington was offered an unpaid volunteer position as one of Braddock's aides. Washington accepted, writing to Braddock's principal aide, Captain Robert Orme, "I wish for nothing more earnestly than to attain a small degree of knowledge in the military art, and that the position would provide him a good opportunity of forming an acquaintance which may be serviceable hereafter, if I can find it worthwhile pushing my fortune in the military way." When Braddock's regulars arrived in Alexandria, Washington spent much time there, observing infantry drills and other internal workings of the army, and even copied Braddock's orders to absorb the style in which they were written. The expedition finally marched off in April 1755, and made extremely slow progress along the road Washington had cut in 1754, owing to the heavy artillery and long baggage train. Braddock and his entourage arrived at Fort Cumberland on May 10. From there the progress slowed even further as the army made its way to the Monongahela River. Washington fell ill with dysentery en route, and only rejoined the column on July 8, when it was nearing the Monongahela. The next day, after Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage's light infantry had crossed the Monongahela about 10 miles from Fort Duquesne, they stumbled into a French and Indian force that had been sent to locate them. Both sides were surprised, but the French and Indians quickly organized themselves and made a vicious onslaught against the British. Gage's men, and the work crews they were guarding, turned and fled in a panic, right into the arriving column of regulars, which included Braddock and his entourage. The discipline of the British regulars broke down, and a panicked retreat began, with the French and Indians firing at them from the cover of the surrounding woods. Braddock lost several horses, and eventually went down with a mortal wound. Washington was one of the few of Braddock's aides to emerge relatively unscathed, despite being significantly involved in the fighting. He had 2 horses shot out from under him, and 4 bullets pierced his coat. He sustained no injuries and showed coolness under fire. Braddock, who had been loaded onto a wagon in a makeshift litter, ordered Washington to ride back to fetch the remainder of the army that was working its way up from the Great Meadows. The battered remnants of Braddock's force eventually returned to Fort Cumberland, where Washington wrote letters harshly critical of the event. To Governor Dinwiddie he reported that, although the British officers fought well, their cowardly dogs of soldiers did not. The Virginians, he said, acquitted themselves well. They behaved like men, and died like soldiers. His reports burnished the reputation of the Virginia Regiment, and Washington was lauded as the hero of Monongahela for his work organizing the retreat. Dinwiddie was also forced to acknowledge Washington's gallant behavior, and the Virginia House of Burgesses reorganized the colony's defenses with Washington as colonel of a 1,200-strong regiment.